For generations, centuries before the Grand Canyon was declared a national park, and many years before a mysterious newspaper report drew widespread attention, the Hopi people carried forward an extraordinary tradition. They spoke about a hidden world beneath the canyon, not a symbolic realm below or a destination after death, but enormous underground chambers where their ancestors once lived and where strange beings were believed to have existed long before the current world came into existence. According to Hopi traditions, these beings were tall, covered with hair, and lived far below the canyon's surface. They were remembered not as creatures of fear or imaginary stories, but as a part of the ancient history preserved through the Bear Clan and passed down across countless generations. Then in April 1909, an Arizona newspaper released a story that seemed surprisingly familiar. A government-backed explorer claimed he had uncovered a secret cave carved deep within the walls of the Grand Canyon. Within it were underground rooms, preserved mummies, strange artifacts, and writings unlike anything archaeologists had ever recorded in North America. The report quickly traveled throughout the nation. Then, it vanished. Over a century later, one mystery still remains. Was the newspaper reporting an elaborate deception, or had it discovered the same underground world the Hopi had spoken about for generations? Today we are exploring historical documents, Hopi oral traditions, and the events behind one of the most controversial stories ever linked to the Grand Canyon. To understand why the 1909 Grand Canyon mystery continues to capture attention more than 100 years later, we must look much further back, before explorers charted the canyon, before archaeologists studied its cliffs, and before the Arizona Gazette released its famous article. The Hopi were already sharing stories about what existed beneath the canyon. For the Hopi people, this was never just a myth. It was a part of their heritage and history. Their oldest spoken traditions describe humanity moving through multiple worlds before reaching the world we live in today. According to these teachings, the current world was not the beginning. Previous worlds were destroyed by powerful disasters, and each time those who survived were led to safety before eventually entering a new era. This journey of emergence is one of the central beliefs of Hopi tradition. The place where this occurred is called the Sipapu, a sacred opening through which the ancestors entered the present world after spending time beneath the earth. Unlike many creation stories from different cultures, the Hopi tradition describes a real location connected to the landscape of northern Arizona rather than only a symbolic paradise or spiritual dimension. But what makes this tradition even more fascinating is what the ancestors were believed to have encountered before their journey was finished. According to the Bear Clan, whose spoken history has protected many of the oldest Hopi teachings, beings were already living beneath the earth. The Hopi referred to them as the ant people. Despite this name, the descriptions do not match normal ants or insects. They are remembered as intelligent beings who lived within underground chambers and held knowledge of the hidden world beneath the surface. During periods of disaster, they offered shelter to the ancestors, guarded them, and helped them survive until the time came when it was safe to return above ground. Some traditions describe them as taller than humans. Others recall them as covered with hair, and almost all accounts share one significant detail. They lived beneath the canyon. For generations, these stories were protected through oral tradition, carefully passed from one generation to another long before they were documented by historians or anthropologists. They remained an important part of Hopi cultural memory, existing separately from newspapers, archaeology, and official expeditions. Then, in the spring of 1909, a newspaper released a story that seemed almost unbelievably similar. Before we move forward, if you enjoy documentaries that uncover forgotten history through ancient records, archaeology, and indigenous knowledge, consider subscribing. It supports the channel and helps me continue researching stories like this. Because the report published in Arizona that year did not simply describe a regular cave, it described an underground civilization that appeared remarkably similar to the one the Hopi had been describing for generations. On the morning of April 5, 1909, readers of the Arizona Gazette opened their newspapers to what would become one of the most disputed stories ever associated with the Grand Canyon. The headline announced an incredible archaeological discovery. According to the article, a man named G.E. Kincaid who presented himself as an explorer involved in a government-funded expedition connected to the Smithsonian Institution, had uncovered a hidden cave carved high within the walls of the Grand Canyon. The entrance, the newspaper claimed, could only be reached by traveling along the Colorado River by boat because it was located hundreds of feet above the river on a nearly straight cliff wall. But what truly captured attention was not only the location, it was the incredible discovery Kincaid claimed to have made inside. The article described a huge underground structure stretching deep into the stone. A long main passage was said to extend for over 1,000 feet, with numerous chambers spreading out in every direction. Some areas reportedly contained carefully preserved supplies of grain that had somehow survived for centuries. Others contained pottery, copper instruments, weapons, and carved items unlike anything archaeologists had connected to the ancient civilizations of the American Southwest. Then the story became even more unusual. Kincaid claimed to have discovered multiple mummies positioned in a seated posture rather than lying down, carefully wrapped and preserved within the chambers. Nearby were statues and carved figures that, according to the report, seemed to display artistic influences more commonly linked to Egypt or Asia instead of ancient North America. The chamber walls were also said to contain markings and inscriptions that neither Kincaid nor the expedition's archaeologist could explain. They documented measurements, photographed parts of the location, and continued recording details of the chambers through several visits. Just 4 days later, on April 9th, the Arizona Gazette released another article providing more information about the discovery. Instead of dismissing the first report as a prank or unverified rumor, the newspaper added further descriptions of the expedition, the cave's design, and the extraordinary collection of artifacts supposedly found within. To people reading the story in 1909, it sounded less like a fantasy and more like the announcement of a discovery that could completely transform the understanding of ancient history in the American Southwest. But then, something strange occurred. The story suddenly came to an end. No photographs of the chambers were ever released. No artifacts were displayed in museums, no official scientific study ever followed, and the expedition that was supposedly responsible for one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in American history appeared to disappear almost as quickly as it had arrived. That disappearance became just as puzzling as the cave itself. As curiosity surrounding the Arizona Gazette report increased, researchers began asking the most obvious question. If this expedition truly took place, where was the evidence? The newspaper had named the explorer as G.E. Kincaid and claimed that the work was connected to the Smithsonian Institution through an archaeologist known as Professor Asa Jordan. If one of the most important archaeological discoveries in American history had actually happened, there should have been photographs, excavation documents, letters, museum archives, or at least some official confirmation that the expedition existed. Instead, investigators discovered almost no evidence. Throughout the years, historians and independent researchers searched for records that could verify the expedition mentioned in the newspaper. The Smithsonian has repeatedly explained that it has no documentation of G.E. Kincaid working for the institution, no evidence of Professor S.A. Jordan being involved with such an expedition, and no record of artifacts resembling those described in the Arizona Gazette articles. For many historians, this was enough proof to consider the story nothing more than a carefully created newspaper hoax. However, others believed the situation was not that straightforward. The newspaper itself was authentic. The April 5th and April 9th editions definitely existed, and researchers confirmed that both articles were genuinely printed in 1909. The real mystery was never whether the newspaper published the story. The real question was whether the events described within those articles actually happened. That difference matters. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers sometimes published dramatic and sensational stories alongside normal reporting. At the same time, real archaeological discoveries were also often announced through newspapers before official scientific publications were released. Being printed in a newspaper did not automatically prove a discovery was real, but it also did not automatically prove it was false. Later, researchers discovered another important detail. Just 3 years before the Arizona Gazette article appeared, the Antiquities Act of 1906 had been passed into law, giving the federal government control over significant archaeological discoveries found on federal lands. The Grand Canyon was already protected by federal authority, meaning any major discovery there would have likely involved government oversight. The Smithsonian regularly cooperated with federal agencies on archaeological projects during this era, making the newspaper's claims understandable within the historical setting, even though no expedition records have ever been publicly verified. Years later, researchers continued searching for more evidence. Some claim to have discovered scattered mentions of a man named G.E. Kincaid in unrelated historical documents, suggesting that someone with that name may have existed. Others pointed toward possible gaps in archival records from that period, although missing documents can happen for many normal reasons, including poor preservation, cataloging mistakes, or simple loss over time. None of these discoveries alone prove that the 1909 Grand Canyon expedition happened. So more than 100 years later, the mystery remains caught between two possibilities. Either the Arizona Gazette published one of the most detailed archaeological hoaxes of its time, or it reported on an expedition whose full history has never been recovered. And that uncertainty becomes even more intriguing when the newspaper's description is placed beside something that had existed long before 1909. The Hopi traditions had already been describing underground chambers and unusual beings beneath the Grand Canyon for generations, long before anyone claimed to discover a hidden chamber inside the Grand Canyon. The Hopi had already been telling a remarkably similar story. For generations, Hopi elders passed these traditions from one generation to the next through their clan system. Unlike written histories that can disappear with time, Hopi knowledge survived through continuous oral transmission, carefully preserved by elders whose responsibility was to remember and teach the history of their people. Among the oldest of these traditions is the story of the Ant People. To someone hearing the name for the first time, it sounds almost mythical, but the Hopi descriptions are far more detailed than the name suggests. The Ant People were not remembered as ordinary insects or imaginary creatures. They were described as intelligent beings who lived beneath the earth inside underground chambers. During times of great catastrophe, when earlier worlds were destroyed, these beings sheltered the ancestors of the Hopi, providing protection until it was safe to return to the surface. According to the Hopi emergence tradition, humanity eventually came into the present world through the Sipapu, a sacred opening that marked the transition from the underground world to the one we know today. What makes these traditions especially interesting is that they describe the underground world as a real place rather than a symbolic one. The stories speak of chambers beneath the land, long migrations through underground passages, and guides who already knew those hidden places before the Hopi ancestors arrived. To the Hopi, these accounts were part of their history and identity, not simply stories created for entertainment. Anthropologists have generally studied them as elements of Hopi cosmology and religious tradition, while many Hopi continue to regard them as sacred teachings. Then there are the descriptions of the beings themselves. Different versions of the tradition contain different details, but some themes appear repeatedly. Several accounts describe them as larger than ordinary people. Others remember them as being covered in hair, and nearly all agree that they belong to the underground world beneath the canyon, rather than the villages built later on the mesas. By themselves, these traditions would simply be an important part of Hopi cultural history. But when placed beside the Arizona Gazette story, the similarities become difficult to ignore. A newspaper describes hidden chambers deep inside the Grand Canyon. The Hopi describe an underground world beneath the canyon. The newspaper reports preserved remains and unexplored passageways. The Hopi remember ancient beings who lived below the surface long before the present age. None of those parallels prove that the newspaper story was true. They do not prove that the cave existed exactly as it was described, but they do raise an important historical question. Could two completely different sources, one a newspaper published in 1909 and the other an oral tradition preserved for generations before that, be pointing toward the same place? Either the Arizona Gazette created one of the most elaborate archaeological hoaxes of its era, or it documented an expedition whose complete story has never been uncovered. And this mystery becomes even more fascinating when the newspaper's account is compared with something that existed long before 1909. For generations before anyone claimed to find a hidden chamber inside the Grand Canyon, Hopi traditions had already spoken about underground chambers and mysterious beings beneath the canyon. The Hopi had already been sharing a surprisingly similar account. For countless generations, Hopi elders carried these traditions forward from one generation to another through their clan system. Unlike written records that may fade or disappear over time, Hopi knowledge continued through a living oral tradition carefully protected by elders whose role was to preserve and pass on the history of their people. Among the oldest of these teachings is the story of the Ant People. To someone unfamiliar with the tradition, the name may sound like a simple myth, but the Hopi descriptions are much deeper and more detailed than the name alone suggests. The Ant People were not remembered as common insects or imaginary beings. They were described as intelligent beings who lived below the earth within underground chambers. During periods of great disaster when earlier worlds were destroyed, these beings protected the ancestors of the Hopi, offering shelter and guidance until the time came when they could safely return to the surface. According to Hopi emergence traditions, humanity eventually entered the present world through the Sipapu, a sacred opening that represented the movement from the underground realm into the world known today. What makes these traditions particularly fascinating is that they describe the underground world as an actual location rather than only a symbolic idea. The stories mention chambers beneath the earth, extended journeys through underground pathways, and guides who were already familiar with those hidden places before the Hopi ancestors reached them. For the Hopi, these accounts were not merely fictional stories, but an essential part of their history, culture, and identity. Anthropologists have typically examined them as important parts of Hopi beliefs and spiritual traditions, while many Hopi people continue to view them as sacred teachings. Then there are the descriptions of the beings themselves. Different versions of the tradition include varying details, but several themes appear again and again. Some accounts describe them as taller than ordinary humans. Others remember them as covered with hair, and almost all agree that they belong to the underground world beneath the canyon rather than the later villages built on the mesas. On their own, these traditions represent an important part of Hopi cultural heritage. But when compared with the Arizona Gazette story, the similarities become difficult to overlook. The newspaper describes hidden chambers located deep within the Grand Canyon. The Hopi describe an underground world beneath the canyon. The newspaper mentions preserved remains and unknown passageways. The Hopi remember ancient beings who lived below the surface before the current world existed. These connections do not prove that the newspaper story was accurate. They do not confirm that the cave existed exactly as described, but they do create a fascinating historical question. Could two completely separate sources, one being a newspaper report from 1909 and the other an oral tradition preserved for generations before it, have been describing the same location? That mystery becomes even more fascinating when we examine the canyon itself, because the Grand Canyon is not just one enormous open valley. It is a landscape containing vast natural cave systems, especially within the Redwall Limestone Formation. Many areas are still incredibly challenging to reach, and even today, significant sections of the canyon's cliffs and underground networks have never been fully explored. Perhaps that is why this story has continued for so many years. Not because anyone has proven exactly what exists beneath the canyon, but because no one has ever completely solved the mystery either. And more than a century after the Arizona Gazette released its extraordinary report, the Grand Canyon continues to protect its deepest secrets. More than 100 years have passed since the Arizona Gazette published its unusual story. Throughout that time, countless books have been written about the Grand Canyon. Millions of people have visited its edges looking into one of the most researched landscapes on the planet. Geologists have spent decades studying its layers of ancient rock. Archaeologists have recorded settlements, pathways, and artifacts belonging to the many indigenous communities who have lived in this region for thousands of years. Yet even with all of this research, the story from April 1909 has never fully disappeared. It continues to return because it raises a question that has never received an answer accepted by everyone. If the article was describing a real expedition, where are the photographs, research notes, and discovered artifacts? If it was only an exaggerated newspaper creation, why was it presented with such unusual detail, including chamber measurements, artifact descriptions, and references to places that are still difficult to access today? History has never delivered a final conclusion. Instead, it has left behind pieces of a much larger puzzle: a newspaper report, a Smithsonian rejection, a canyon containing thousands of caves, and an indigenous tradition that existed for generations before the newspaper article was ever published. The Grand Canyon itself creates another fascinating part of the mystery. Most visitors only experience the canyon from the rim, gazing across a massive landscape shaped by the Colorado River over millions of years. But beneath those towering cliffs exists a complex hidden world of natural caves, concealed shelves, narrow tunnels, and rock formations formed through immense stretches of time. The Redwall limestone alone contains large cave networks, many of which can only be reached through expert climbing or difficult river journeys. Even today, much of this underground environment remains unexplored and unmapped in detail. This does not prove that the cave described in 1909 was real, but it does show that the canyon is much larger, deeper, and more complicated than many people realize. Then there is the Hopi viewpoint. In 2000, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office released a statement regarding sacred locations within the Grand Canyon. Rather than supporting additional investigation, the statement highlighted that certain areas inside the canyon hold deep spiritual importance and should not be treated as places for public exploration. It did not confirm the Arizona Gazette report, nor did it support every claim associated with the story. Instead, it called for understanding and respect. This difference is important because throughout this documentary, we have examined three very different forms of evidence: a newspaper article, scientific and geological understanding of the canyon, and an oral tradition carefully maintained within Hopi culture for countless generations. Each contributes a different piece of the mystery, but none of them alone provides a complete answer. History is rarely so straightforward. Sometimes discoveries provide answers to questions from the past. Other times, they create mysteries that never existed before. The Grand Canyon has done both. It has uncovered ancient settlements, communities, trails, and sacred locations that have completely changed our understanding of the American Southwest. Yet at the same time, it continues to contain areas that remain hidden and unreachable. Perhaps someday, new discoveries through advanced technology, including high-resolution LiDAR scans, improved cave mapping methods, or future archaeological investigations, will uncover evidence that finally resolves the mystery surrounding the 1909 story. Or perhaps the answer was never concealed within the canyon itself. Maybe it has always remained within the traditions of the people who understood this land long before newspapers, government expeditions, or national parks ever existed. The Hopi have never claimed to hold every explanation. What they have protected is a memory of rising from beneath the earth, a memory of hidden underground chambers, and a memory of mysterious beings who were already present when their ancestors began their journey into the world we know today. Whether these accounts represent actual history, sacred teachings, or a combination of both is something that continues to be discussed by each new generation. What remains undeniable is that these traditions have endured for centuries. They existed long before the newspaper article, long before Arizona became a modern state, and long before anyone began searching for answers about the 1909 expedition. Perhaps that is why the Grand Canyon continues to capture our imagination, not because every secret has been uncovered, but because each generation returns to those same ancient cliffs and asks the same haunting question: what, if anything, is still waiting beneath them? Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that uncover forgotten history through ancient records, archaeology, indigenous knowledge, and original sources, consider subscribing for more investigations like this. And before you leave, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you believe the Hopi traditions and the 1909 Grand Canyon report are entirely separate stories? Or is it possible they preserve different memories of the same mysterious location? Share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll meet you in the next documentary. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nature Mystery Unravel Mysteries. Learn untold tales of history and stay in the exciting world of new discoveries.